Our final presentation is Dr. Neal Bernard. He's going to be discussing animal foods and processed foods, the role of biological processing. Neal, you're on.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see me all right. I'm giving this presentation using the best technology that an airport can provide.
Loud and clear.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Let me share my screen. I took these photographs outside my childhood home in North Dakota, and you'll see cornfields as far as the eye can see. Really very beautiful. But as you know, corn can be processed. It can be processed into corn flakes, and a number of people have asserted that there are issues with regard to this. Now, some of those issues may be positive, some may be negative. When you have processing of corn into corn flakes, you are adding sugar. On the other hand, you're also enriching it with vitamins and minerals. And yet, I'm quite convinced that there is substantial evidence that when you look at processing overall in epidemiologic observational studies rather than clinical trials, you do see associations with metabolic syndrome and other issues. And so I don't need to repeat this, but as you know, the NOVA system has classified these foods in 4 different categories. A big problem has arisen, though, that there is a conflict. If you look at corn flakes in the U.S. dietary guidelines, they're considered okay for up to about half of grains. They can be refined grains, and the guidelines say favor the enriched varieties. The NOVA system says, no, these are ultra-processed foods. Untrimmed red meat, a big steak, is recommended to be generally avoided in the U.S. dietary guidelines, but the NOVA system says, A-OK, that's all group 1. So these conflicts were resolved by Montero by saying what really matters is processing, and the macronutrient intake is secondary. Well, this has been turned from a scientific issue to perhaps a political and social issue. In November of last year, there was a Future of Health Summit, and a member of the U.S. Senate said, as you can see, there's nothing wrong with red meat. The problem is just processed meats. And of course, he comes from the state of Kansas, where we're talking about a commercial product. But this has also been something that the public has adopted as well. Well, I don't eat processed foods, but anything unprocessed must be all right, regardless of its macronutrient intake. And let me propose that we can view processing in different ways. There is mechanical processing that's going to stamp corn into corn flakes. There is chemical processing, where perhaps grains, such as corn, might be distilled into spirits. But there is also a biological factory. And the biological factory looks like this. You can feed corn into this system, and out from this biological factory will come eggs, or will come muscle tissue. And the factory, this chicken in this case, they are carefully selected and genetically manipulated so that they are very efficient producers of the end products for commercial value. Now, Montero, in developing the NOVA system, did describe biological processing. He described, for example, that if you look at the use of microorganisms, use yeast, you can produce wine, or you can produce bread or beer, or you can use bacteria to produce sauerkraut, or perhaps kimchi. And molds can be used. So if I use Aspergillus mold, I can use this to produce miso or soy sauce or sake. But there are other uses of organisms to process foods were effectively disregarded in the NOVA system. Let me mention that there has been quite a lot of use of animals as biological systems to execute food processing. One of the most bizarre is the processing of coffee berries, also sometimes called coffee cherries. This is the factory. This is an Asian palm civet, and the coffee cherries are fed to this animal. The animal then has a digestive tract that removes the pulp and excretes the coffee beans, which are then sold as a novelty product. I have to say it doesn't improve the flavor, but fecal material is sold as a novelty product. Corn can also be used in a biological system to produce another novelty product. This is, in this case, the machine that is used as a duck. And this is the procedure. Gavage can cause fatty liver in the duck. But of course, if you sold fatty liver using the English label, nobody would buy it. But if you translate it into French, it becomes something that you can sell for quite high prices. So let's walk through the biological factory that we're considering here. When chickens are used, it's 6 weeks from corn to chicken muscle. And the process starts with saliva, where amylase, of course, is important in digesting carbohydrate. Excess food can go into the crop for storage until it's sent into the proventriculus, which is effectively the stomach. Stomach acid and pepsin will then work on the corn, pulling the amino acids apart. The gizzard then uses ingested stones and muscular action for mechanical grinding. And now we're going into the duodenum, where enzymes and bile will continue the digestive process. In the small intestine, the nutrients are absorbed. In the large intestine, water is absorbed and fiber is separated out. So what has this machine done? Well, one of the noteworthy things is that it alters proteins. When we look at the amino acid sequence of the proteins that went in and compare them to the proteins that went out, we're seeing a lot of difference. Plant proteins have a certain amino acid sequence that is changed when they're fed to animals. This changes not only the amino acid quantity, but the amino acid sequence. And the question is that beneficial? As we've seen, the whole idea of protein quality, which relates to the amino acid content that in relation to or in comparison with human needs, animal products have been said to have better quality. So if you feed corn to a chicken, you're going to be able to take the amino acids and improve their quality. But some killjoys at Harvard University wanted to see, is there anything really to this? And what they discovered in evaluating mortality over time in 131,000 research participants was that if one were to substitute in the place of poultry protein, if one were to use plant protein, mortality goes down. The same is shown when egg protein is replaced with plant protein, mortality goes down. There are other concerns about converting plant proteins to animal proteins. Heterocyclic amines are formed, and you're well aware of these carcinogenic compounds. FIP is a particularly common one. Our research team went into retail stores and fast food restaurants, McDonald's, Applebee's, Burger King, Chick-fil-A, and others in the state of California. We sampled grilled chicken products and we sent them all to a laboratory. We found heterocyclic amines in every single sample in every single restaurant, simply because heating up animal proteins predictably causes the formation of heterocyclic amines. So the alteration of protein that's executed by the biological factory is questionable with regard to whether it's actually doing good or doing harm. Fats are altered, of course. Corn oil is about 14% saturated fat. Fed to a chicken, the fat is modified to about 30% saturated fat. Cholesterol is not existent in the corn, but it's made in the animal's body, and for good reason. And the reason is that you're not a potted plant. Potted plants don't need to be particularly flexible. You do. And to have flexibility, the cell membranes have little cholesterol hinges in them that permit flexibility of the membrane and allow movement. So we're changing protein, we're changing fat, we're also changing carbohydrate. We're removing it. There's plenty of carbohydrate in corn, there isn't any in chicken. We're doing the same with fiber. There's plenty of fiber in corn, there isn't any in chicken. Well, I shouldn't say that we're actually totally removing it. What farmers do is they sequester the fiber. Here's where it goes. After the 6 weeks of a chicken's life, after they are removed from the chicken shed and slaughtered, the chicken litter can be removed and sold. It can be used either as fertilizer or it can be fed to cows. Now that sounds, for those of you who may find this shocking, cattle can be induced excuse me for the background noise. Cattle can be induced to eat chicken feces and chicken litter, provided it's mixed with cattle feed in amounts no more than about 15% of their feed. So there's a method called deep stacking, in which chicken farmers will stack the litter. And the whole idea is that as it's stacked, it heats up, and the idea is to kill salmonella and other microorganisms so that it can be fed to animals. Steroid hormones are added by this biological factory into the muscle tissue. This has been of concern when the poultry litter is used, because there's steroid hormones are also in the excrement. And so if I'm using this as a fertilizer, it could have environmental consequences. Let me invite you, if you're interested in exploring animal manure's role in health, you might want to go to the North American Manure Expo, which is coming up next month, and they promise you thrilling demonstrations at a cost of about $7 for a seat. Come join us in New York. If you are looking not at a chicken, but at using a cow as a biological machine, well, the cow has a stomach with 4 compartments. The rumen allows about 48 hours of fermentation, and then the smaller particles are separated out by the reticulum and sent down through the omasum and the abomasum, where the digestive processes occur. Then again, as in the chicken, the small intestine and the large intestine participate in nutrient absorption in the case of the small intestine, water absorption in the case of the large intestine. And once again, I'm rearranging the plant proteins into bovine proteins. And once again, when we look at the health consequences of rearranging the amino acid sequence, we're not seeing health benefits. The Harvard researchers looked at red meat, and it won't surprise you that if you substitute in the place of red meat plant proteins, you see a reduction in mortality risk. Same thing with replacing dairy protein with plant protein. So also for those who are thinking about fish, the Harvard researchers saw exactly the same issue. When plant protein is used in the place of fish protein, observed mortality is reduced. Heterocyclic amines, their #1 source is chicken, but they're also in red meat. And the alteration of the fat is similar with a bovine machine rather than just a poultry. But what we see is that the increase in saturated fat is even greater, goes from 14% in the corn oil to 50% in beef fat. Cholesterol, of course, is added. There's plenty of cholesterol in all muscle products. And a particular addition that we're concerned about with regard to bovine products is the addition of estradiol. Estradiol is produced by cows normally, but when they are used on milking operations, and they're artificially inseminated annually and are milked well into the pregnancy, estradiol is produced in increasing quantities as gestation continues. It's identifiable in the milk. The dairy industry says this should not be a problem because the amounts are very low. But Gary Fraser and his group at Loma Linda said, well, wait a minute, we are seeing with increased consumption of milk, which is the x-axis, we're seeing increased breast cancer risk on the y-axis. Similar findings came from China in the Kadoorie Biobank study, where they looked at more than 500,000 participants. And like the Adventist population, it's different from other populations in that you have a large number of people who don't consume dairy at all, which gives you a great ability to contrast wide variations in dairy intake. And here again, we see increased breast cancer with dairy consumption. So the Adventist Health Study showed us, as did EPIC and many others, that the more you get away from the animal-derived products, the healthier you may be from the standpoint of body weight or type 2 diabetes. So there are mechanical factors. There are chemical factors. And there are biological factories. And if we look at what they do, converting grain to flakes will add sugar, add salt, or it may, depending on the manufacturer. It may also add vitamins and preservatives and colors, and it may or may not remove fiber. The biological factory that does this conversion has actually a far greater effect on the product because the proteins are rearranged, the saturated fats is greatly increased, cholesterol is produced and added, carbohydrates are gone, fiber is gone, hormones are added to it. What I am going to suggest may be a useful way to harmonize the NOVA system with, say, the dietary guidelines or other macronutrient-based systems is yes, you could consider cornflakes to be a processed food. As Dr. Kaliova mentioned, that may not be a problem with regard to health outcomes, but some may consider it so. But an ultra-processed food would be the product of the animal when used as a biological factory. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.